So this morning, we are looking at, let's make sure I did the right thing. I did. A man by the name of Donatus, and we're actually not going to say a lot about him. There's not a whole lot to know about him, but the movement that originated from his name is one of the most significant controversies in the early church, and one of the most perplexing. If not perplexing in terms of understanding what's going on, we have a fairly good idea of what was going on, but perplexing in that it's one of the heresies, schisms, that, at least for me, is a little harder to want to side with the good guys. I'm not advocating any heresy this morning. And yet, as you'll see from this particular episode in church history, who the good guys are and who the bad guys are is not always quite as neat and tidy as it was, say, last week when we looked at the Arians. I doubt that any of us have any sympathy toward the Arians. If you do, I was just say let me know, but maybe keep it to yourself. But just, it would show you a different church. We don't want to have sympathy toward the Arians, and yet this Donatist controversy will pull us in some different directions. Tricia, that's my wife, Tricia and I don't have time to watch many movies. I can't think of the last time. No, I do remember we went on vacation. We all went to see the Top Gun movie, and we made the mistake of taking all of us to see the Top Gun movie. So I didn't see the Top Gun movie. I went out to the saddest mall you'd ever seen in Muncie, Indiana, where we were. That's just where we were. And walked around for 2 hours with Susanna and Andrew while everyone else. So they all said it was a very good movie. So I don't know. I just know Tom Cruise and I are both aging the same. So we don't watch many movies, we don't watch much TV. If there is TV on, some sports on in the background, or Joanna Gaines on in the background. You can guess which of those is for which of us. But one show that we watched, and they haven't made any, they stopped making this show 10 years ago, maybe a while ago, but we watched through all of the episodes of Foyle's War. Any of you heard of Foyle's War? So it's a British crime drama, and it stars this very laconic, very taciturn British detective, Foyle, and he's very, British. He doesn't say much. He doesn't show any sort of emotion, but he is, for the most part, a very good character, and you're drawn to him, and he has high morals. It's a detective story, a crime story. Somebody gets murdered in every episode, but it's set in the context of World War II, and the series goes through the lead up to the war. It starts in maybe 1940 as the war is starting in Britain, and then goes through into the beginning of the Cold War. And so the backdrop of this series, besides the detective each week, it's not really a weekly show, is World War II. And it was praised for being really historically researched and really trying to draw on the sorts of things that happened in Britain during World War II. And one of the things that happens as the show progresses and the war is over, you see soldiers returning, and it deals with many of the complications that were common after the war. Sure, many of the soldiers returning were given a hero's welcome. They had fought very nobly on the beaches, as Churchill said. They were lauded and celebrated. But what about the ones who refused to fight? What about the ones who were there and yet they chickened out during the fight, or they faked some sort of injury or hid away in an infirmary? Or what about the ones who were conscientious objectors? Or what about, in one of the episodes, what about those who were captured by the Nazis and went to Germany and then came out on the side of the Nazis, and then when they come back, they say that they were just pretending to be on the side? What about those who were captured and gave secrets? What about those who were plainly on the side of the enemy, and then as they return, they change their mind? All sorts of complications. What do you do? These complications, once the war is over, and telling the story, of course, from the perspective of the British, what about those who seem to have been on the other side, or they weren't quite as brave as you would like them to be on your side? And they play on these complexities, and they don't really try to solve them in each episode, they just present them. Is it best to forgive and forget? Hey, the war is over, let's get on with life, let's stop fighting. The war's over, let's not continue this anymore. Didn't we want to be done with that? Or what if the soldiers had behaved badly, dishonorably, cowardly? Some would say that just give them a chance to live their life now. Or, on the other hand, well, they should have some consequences for the way in which they behave poorly toward their country. And shouldn't there be some distinction between those soldiers who fought very nobly and bravely, and then those who were something of a coward, let alone a traitor? Do we want to send the message that we are indifferent to those who demonstrated great sacrifice and bravery? I imagine these sorts of issues, not just in this show having to do with Britain, but almost any conflict, any country, any army, there are questions like this. Your mind is focused for a time when the battle is raging. We just have to win this war. But when the war is over, well, what do you do? Because not everyone fought in the same way, the same skill, the same bravery. And it's no different with the church. We've talked a lot in this Sunday school class about the various waves of persecution that swept over the church. And we've hinted at some of the complexity surrounding persecution. What would you have done? And now we come to this question, which has been in the background and comes finally to the foreground in the 4th century when the persecution is over. And that is, namely, what do you do with those who gave in to the persecution? What do you do in particular if it was your pastor, if it was your bishop, if it was your church leader, and the soldiers knocked on his door and wanted him to throw a pinch of incense to the emperor, or wanted him to hand over the keys to the church building, or they wanted him to hand over the sacred scriptures, and he did? Then what do you do? A schism just means a separation. A schism erupted in the church in the 4th century over these very issues. And as I said, and as we tell this story, you'll see discerning the good guys and the bad guys is not always as simple as it was with the Arians and the Nicenes. Remember, the great persecution, I know this is hard to see over there, the great persecution, as it became known, began in AD 303 under the Emperor Diocletian. There had been persecution, sporadic, regional, but this was really the last and the worst of the persecuting emperors under Diocletian. It was especially intense for priests, for bishops. Many were beaten, imprisoned, tortured. Others were martyred. Many Christians, clergy and lay people, gave in to the imperial pressure. They worshipped pagan gods. They gave up churches or artifacts. They handed over scriptures. Diocletian was particularly concerned with wiping out Christianity more than he was wiping out the Christians. Now, later it came to be, well, if the only way to do this is to get the Christians. But do you understand the difference? It wasn't that his regime said we have to eliminate every Christian in the empire. Remember, by this point, Christians were 10, 15% of the empire. That was not a plausible goal to go and to try to kill. That takes a lot of resources. What he wanted, however, was to eliminate Christianity and reinstitute the glory of pagan Rome and the gods and goddesses of ancient Rome. Coercing Christians, killing Christians, was actually a last resort. And there's almost always going to be this sort of parallel that it can be the proverbial frog in the kettle as the temperature gets hotter and hotter, and you don't realize it until you're boiling. Rarely does the cultural or the state pressure come first and foremost, we're throwing you into jail, we want to kill you. That takes a lot of work. It's the sort of pressure that just says, would you give up what you believe? Would you stop these things that you're thinking? And so he wanted to rid the empire of Christianity. And the first prong of attack was to attack what made Christianity work. And what made Christianity work, as he saw it, was three things. I'll just give them as 3 B's, because that's very convenient. Bishops, buildings, and books. Those were the 3 things he saw. Well, if we can get at the bishops, that is, the leaders in the church, so they have a church hierarchy by this point, and you have priests over a local church, and then you have over a larger region, you have the bishops, so the bishops had great authority. And the buildings, so Christianity was not yet a fully recognized legal religion as it would be under Constantine, but they did have church buildings. Constantine would say you give the church buildings back to them. So during this phase, many of the buildings were handed over. So they had, some of them, buildings in which they met, and then books. It says something about the bookishness of the Christian faith, that books, now sacred scripture, of course, Bibles would be most important, but also letters, documents from martyr stories, liturgies, baptismal formulas. And this really set apart Christianity from most of the other religions, and certainly the religion of the empire, which was fixated on ritual. It was what you did. It was going and offering a sacrifice, doing incense. But Christianity from the very beginning was centered around written texts. And so Diocletian thought, if we can get the bishops and the buildings and the books, we'll be on our way, and the Christians will then give up. Now, his calculus was wrong on almost every level, but you can understand the strategy. So imagine you are a bishop during Diocletian's first edict. So at first, he's not trying to kill the Christians. What he wants is the bishop to give over the buildings and give over the books. Because if they don't have a place to meet and they don't have their sacred writings, then Christianity, as we know it, will fall apart. So imagine you're a bishop and a local soldier knocks on your door and they want your church and anything valuable in your church. They want to look and see, do you have gold and silver? Do you have precious utensils, metals? And they want your books. The property will be handed over to the Roman authorities so they can do it what they want, and then the books are going to be burned. Now, we instinctively and rightly would say, well, Bishop Kevin, don't give over our church building. Don't hand over our books, especially if they don't have a printing press, they don't have a Bible in everyone's house. It's not like, well, take these Bibles, we can get Bibles. Have you ever heard of Amazon? Come on, Rome. No, they don't have anything like that. You have these scriptures which are rare, which are precious, which are in your church building. So what do? You would hope that your bishop would say, absolutely not over my dead body, which would be perhaps your dead body, or at this first stage, probably thrown into prison. But you might then think to yourself as the bishop, well, could I talk my way out of this? After all, these men who are knocking on my door are probably very low-level officials, maybe even contracted out by the Roman government. They're probably local folks, so it might be like the local Matthews police come and knock on your door. Well, you've been in this area for a while. You know some of it. You went to school with some of these people. Some of these people are your friends. Maybe you can talk them out of it. Maybe your family's intermarried. Maybe you used to socialize. What would you do if one of these men, and you say, didn't we go to school together? Yeah. And they don't really have their heart in it. And they say, you know what, for a small price, I'd be willing to look the other way. Is that what a bishop should do? Should he offer a bribe? These men just want to do their job and be on with it. Would that be a cowardly thing to do, or that would be a wise thing to do? And you can imagine the bishop might think to himself, well, what good will it do if I'm gone and there's no one to lead the church in this region? And if I stand my ground, well, they're going to throw me in prison. And aren't they going to just find one way or another to go and get the building and get the books with or without me? Like when they, I'm not saying that land developers are like persecutors, so don't hear that, but when they came and they're building 80 homes behind our house, and they developed these 50 acres that were sold, and when the developer, and he was very nice, as developers need to be, they came and knocked on my door and told me about what was happening, and we had a 30-foot piece on our property that we needed to sign over to the developers for the road to go through. And so he's negotiating what they would give us, and I kind of said, well, what happens if I just say, absolutely, I will under no circumstances sign over the lien on this 30 feet for your road? And he said sort of nicely, we'll find a way to get it one way or another, was sort of the, it may take a long time. The state may declare it condemned or something. Now, maybe some of you tell me later, he couldn't have done that. Well, we decided to work nicely with him. He must have felt like he absolutely hit the lottery when he was making small talk and realized that his wife also went to Hope College. What are the odds that someone's wife down here would also have gone to a small college in Michigan? He must, yes. Anyways, he gave us, they ended up, we got a half acre in the woods behind our house. So we got something out of it. But what sort of negotiation would you be willing to do if you were the bishop, figuring they're going to get what they want anyways? And might you think to yourself, well, if I die, I'm hard to replace. We can always build a new building. Yes, these writings are important, but somebody could copy a new one. Or what about this? The soldiers are likely illiterate. They're doing their job. How do they know what you give? Do they know the difference between a grocery list or a letter that you wrote to your mom in one of Paul's letters? Do they know the difference between a collection of the 4 Gospels and a book by Herodotus? Do the government agents really know what they're doing? Do they really care? Some edict from miles and miles away. They may be perfectly happy just to take any old book. Thank you, thanks, we got the books, we can send it off to Diocletian, we did our bit, throw the unbeknownst grocery list into the fire. Would that be a cowardly bishop, or would that be a cunning bishop? So these are not as simple as one might think. You have on the one hand the bishop who says, over my dead body. You have the bishop on the other extreme who says, oh, no, I give it all up, and I don't acknowledge anything of my Christian faith. And if you take it, fine, and I'll worship the emperor, fine. You have a lot of nuance in between. That thought experiment isn't meant to justify the bishops. You're thinking, wow, I'm not having a lot of confidence in you, Pastor. But it is to raise that these matters, which can seem very simple to us from the distance of thousands of years, must have been very complicated and confusing. Fast forward then 10 years as we move out of the persecution of Diocletian. What do you do now that the persecution is over? Constantine converts, he becomes the emperor, he consolidates power, and Christianity now, lo and behold, has gone from the oppressed religion to now the favored religion, and under Theodosius later it will become the official religion. What do you do with those who caved under pressure in the midst of the persecution? And in particular, what do you do with the church leaders who caved? There were two classes of people. One, they called the confessors because they confessed Christ. Isn't that what Jesus said? If you confess me, I will confess you before my Father in heaven. They were not ashamed. The confessors were those who stood firm. They were the heroes. They faced threat of banishment or imprisonment or death, and they confessed Christ. But then there are, in Latin, the traditores. Trado is Latin for hand over. You can see our word, a traitor. So the traditores were those who handed over the books in particular, or the bishops who handed over the church buildings. The confessors and the hander-overs, the traitors. Some wanted to be lax. Quickly, easily let everyone back into the church without examination or investigation. You can understand. I've seen this as a pastor with very hard sort of public church discipline cases, and it often happens that the church, which agrees on almost everything, quickly can split on these sorts of issues. So there were those who said, well, aren't we a place for sinners? Aren't we a place of grace and forgiveness? Let's just be thankful that the persecution is over, and it was a hard time for all of us. Let's welcome them back in, and let's move on. On the other hand, some wanted to be more rigorous. They said, now wait a second. You're saying that this man over here who's missing an arm and has a scar on his face and is still dealing with the emaciation from being put into prison, you're saying that this church leader who bears in his body suffering as a confessor, you're saying he's just right on the same level with this man who gave in to the soldiers and has his health and livelihood and has all of his digits and appearance. You're saying that they're the same? Surely this man did something worth commemorating, and surely this man did something that makes us less able to trust. What should we think of a bishop who now says, I'm ready to lead the church again? Well, but we don't have a church. You handed it over. We don't have the scriptures. You gave them to be burned. During an earlier wave of persecution in the 3rd century, Cyprian of Carthage declared that lapsed bishops were no longer legitimate bishops. They had forsaken their calling, forfeited their ordination. They could not administer the sacraments, perform clerical duties, or appoint other clergy. So that was in the mainstream understanding from Cyprian in Carthage in North Africa. Look, if you're a bishop, we're not talking about just a church member, but you were a bishop and you were a traitor. The moment you did that, you de facto renounced your ordination, you renounced your calling. You are no longer a legitimate pastor, no longer a legitimate bishop. You can't do the sacraments. You can't do ordination. No, you can't just come back here and be the pastor, be the bishop. This is all in the background when we come to the election of Bishop Donatus. Where in North Africa, when the important bishopric, just means the seat of the bishop, of Carthage becomes available in 311. So this is when the persecution is just coming to an end. It's not quite over. Carthage, remember, is in North Africa on the coast of the Mediterranean, near where Tunis, Tunisia is today, not too far across the water from Sicily, the boot, the soccer ball next to the boot of Italy. There's a bishop by the name of Mensurius. He is the bishop of this important major city in North Africa of Carthage. And he dies, and a man by the name of, well, let me put this up here so you can see the genealogy. Mensurius dies a man by the name of Cecilian is elected bishop in Carthage. Many of the Christians were not happy with the election of Cecilian. It's hard to tell how many of their objections were true and how many might have been written later into the record to try to give this man a bad name. But here's some of the reasons that have come down to us why they weren't happy about Cecilian being elected bishop. One, there were some, and this is certainly true, there were some irregularities in how he was elected. The region just to the west of Carthage was a place called Numidia. Numidia, modern-day Algeria, just to the west. And before the Numidian bishops could come for this election of the Bishop of Carthage, a vote was already taken. In particular, there's a very important bishop called Secundus, and they took the vote before they got there. And this was seen to have been a political ploy because there's all sorts of regional conflicts. And we didn't wait until the Numidians came because they might have thrown the vote into some other direction. And so many of the Christians said, wait a second, you disenfranchised some of our bishops who were going to vote, and that's how you got your man Cecilian. So there were some irregularities. There was also the fact that earlier in Cecilian's line of ordination, there was a man named Felix. Let's put Felix up there. Felix, who was one of the bishops who had ordained Cecilian as a priest. So you have to be a priest, and then as a priest you can be a bishop. So this man, Felix, was in the line of ordaining Cecilian as a priest. And it was alleged that Felix was one of the traditores, one of the traitors, one of the hander-overs. And the story was that Felix had a relative who was an agent of the emperor, an agent of the empire. And it was believed that Felix handed over the books to be burned to this agent of the empire, and he was a traitor. Now, Felix and those who supported Cecilian said, whoa, you don't have the whole story. Yes, Felix appeared to hand over the books, and maybe he did in the sight of the Roman officials, but this was his relative, and they had worked out an agreement, and later they were going to swap those books for some other books, or this agent was going to give the books back. This was just all a ruse. Felix wasn't really a traitor. But as far as the opponents were concerned, Cecilian had been ordained as a priest by a traitor bishop. And if you're a traitor bishop, it'd be a grocery store, but Trader Joe's. If you're a traitor bishop, then you are not a legitimate bishop. Remember, that's what Cyprian of Carthage said. So if you're not a legitimate bishop and you ordain a priest, Ergo, you must not be a legitimate priest because you had this illegitimate man lay hands on you for ordination. And then there were the even more serious claims that Cecilian had actually persecuted the Christians. And this is where it's very hard to know if this is written back into the record to make Cecilian look bad or if there's truth to it. There's a text called Acts of the Abyntinian Martyrs, who claim that during the persecution, this man, Mensurius, actually switched sides and went over to the side of the empire and became a tormentor of the Christians, and his right-hand man, his henchman, was Cecilian. And the story in this Acts of the Abyntinian Martyrs said that Cecilian stood before the doors of the prison. Remember, you don't have, the government is not giving you 3 square meals a day in prison. This is why in the New Testament it's such a big deal when Paul says, "You were not ashamed and you visited me in my chains," because you just starve and die if you're a prisoner if no one comes and brings you food and water. And if someone comes and brings you food and water in prison, then everyone else can look and say, so you like this prisoner? Oh, you must be as bad as him. It was a very gutsy thing to go and be identified with the prisoner. So the only way the Christians who were in prison were going to live is if other Christians came and brought them food and water. And the story here in this text was that Mensurius and his right-hand man Cecilian guarded the doors. It says he drove them away with whips and lashes, any who came to bring food and water to the Christians. And these Christians did not die by the sword or by the animals in the arena, but even worse, they starved to death in prison because Mensurius and Cecilian prevented them from receiving sustenance. Yeah, it's very hard to know if this written later into the record by the folks who don't like them or if there's truth to it. Whatever all of the reasons were, certainly this was a major one. How can we have a Bishop Cecilian who was ordained by a traitor Bishop Felix? So in 311, the opponents of Cecilian, and this is largely the bishops from Numidia who didn't make it in time, they elected their own bishop. Majorinus is their bishop. Now he dies in 313, so this is 311. He dies in 313, so he's only in the office for a short time. And after he dies, they install a new bishop by the name of Donatus. Hence the name of this rival group which we're introducing here, the Donatists. Donatist was from a Numidian agricultural settlement near the Sahara, and he became the leader of this rival group for almost half a century. This is the beginning of a major split in the church, a major schism. And you have to understand how politics and religion are all overlapping. Because we're liable to think, well, it is terrible when churches go through this sort of thing and they like this person or this person, and so a pastor has to leave or a pastor goes and he starts a new church somewhere. And that's very heartbreaking and it's very difficult to go through, but you deal with it and you move on, and so they got that church and they got that church. But that's not all that's going on here. It's not just, well, you got a church and you got a church, and I guess it's sort of awkward as we overlap and we'll have to see each other. It is also like, and you have a president and we have a president, and we don't think he's the real president or we don't think he's the real president. It has political ramifications because the bishops have great power. It's not just the man who's coming to do the sacraments, but they have great power over ordination for all the other pastors. And as we saw last week, remember with Athanasius, one of the reasons he was banished is because the emperor thought he was threatening to cut off the supply of wheat coming out of Alexandria. They had so much sway often, these bishops, especially 313, Edict of Milan, once Christianity is out of persecution, and now the emperor himself is a Christian, now the bishops have even more power. So who the bishop is not just a matter of what sermon you're going to listen to on Sunday, but who is the political leader in your region. So it's not just a church division, it's a kind of civil war. Add to this, there were a number of regional differences. The Bishop of Rome and several other leading cities declare Sicilian is the true bishop of Carthage. Constantine wants to keep peace, and so he follows their lead, and he says, everyone down there in North Africa, Sicilian is the real bishop. And furthermore, only those in communion with Sicilian will benefit from my pro-Christian policies. So he's starting to have pro-Christian policies, return the church, tax-exempt status for clergy. If you want my favored, my pro-Christian policies, you need to be in alignment with this man. He is the true bishop. Well, the Donatists are upset. They're upset because, look, this is what you always do to us out here in the country. Carthage is the big city, Numidia out to the west. There's a sort of populace versus the elites feel. You went and ordained this man without us, and now you have the emperor on your side, but we're telling you, Donatus is the true bishop. They claim that Sicilian was a traitor and had been ordained by a traitor. And since he was consecrated by, they said, a Judas, how can he be anything other than an illegitimate bishop? And that means everyone that he ordains is not a real priest. And everyone who receives the sacraments from those priests are not getting valid sacraments. We'll come back to, at the end, why I think this shows the weakness of a sacramental view of the church that develops in Rome and elsewhere. Because if you get it messed up at the top, you don't have a legitimate bishop, you don't have legitimate priests, all of the sacraments administered by the priest are no longer legitimate. Well, you are messing up a lot of people's lives. And the controversy was deepened by economic and social tensions. Some questioned whether the Donatists were really as pure as they imagined. There were rumors that, well, some of your priests and bishops had lapsed too. The motivations, we'd like to think, in church history are always just very neatly theological, but people are people. And theology is almost always tied up with personalities and oftentimes with grievances. So further west in Numidia, the people were agricultural. They grew the food. The people in Carthage got rich selling the food in their ports. And this meant resentment. You people are getting rich selling our food. We're poorer. We're actually making the food. And inland, the country folks were initially more Christian. Christianity was more in the lower classes in this region. Christianity appealed to them. It gave them hope for a better life. It gave them hope for an afterlife. And you think about it, when Christianity is not favored, well, the people who are on the lower rungs of society, they have less to lose by joining up with this minority religious group, where those who are the elites have a lot to lose. So those out in Numidia, the poorer, lower rung, now that the emperor is a Christian, and they see that now from their perspective, the hoity-toity out in Carthage are all very happy to become Christians, to their mind they say, well, yeah, sure. Now that it's a cool thing to become a Christian, you all out in the elites, but us lower class farmers, resented that, saw the conversion of the higher classes as a corruption of Christianity. So we can't understand this without understanding there was out in the countryside already bubbling up sort of anti-Carthage sentiment, just like we can understand in our own country. You look at, well, don't the people on the coasts look down on the flyover country? And the people in the middle, don't they say, well, it's the people in New York and D.C. and San Francisco, and they think they're so much better than us. What began as a theological moral issue quickly became a political one. To put some modern labels on it, you could say the Donatists saw themselves as the populists, the anti-empire, the Luke Skywalker and the rebels, a voice for the little guy against the rich and the powerful. The pro-Sicilian group called their opponents, after this bishop, the Donatists, because they are all in alignment following this other bishop. Well, the Sicilians call themselves the Catholiques, the Catholics, because they represent the universal church. Now, to refer to it this way in history is to decide that the Sicilian group was ultimately right, to give them the name. But they gave themselves the name, but some of the Donatists were not very happy with that and said, wait a second, we want to be lowercase. Remember, people aren't thinking Roman Catholicism. They're thinking Catholic, meaning we are the true universal church to which everyone should belong. So some of the Donatists said, well, we're not, you guys are the imposters, not us. But the Sicilians called themselves the Catholics. Well, things went from bad to worse. Around the year 340, a radical, violent group of Donatists emerged. They called themselves the Circumcilians. Sounds very sort of, we're not quite sure if they gave the name to themselves or they just owned it from others or what the derivation may be. The Circumcilians, they also, we know, called themselves the fighters for Christ. They were we're angry and we're not going to take it anymore. They were mostly rural peasants. They were often religious fanatics. They wanted to fight their theological enemies with force. They sought the glory of martyrdom. They were willing to die to fight this false imperial church. On one occasion, a large group of these Circumcilians committed mass suicide by jumping off a cliff together. So this has become a wild movement. The rest of the Donatists didn't quite know what to do with this radical fringe. They tried to disassociate themselves, but not too far, because isn't this what happens? Often you got this populist movement, then there's this radical fringe that it begins to look, well, you other people, you're not radical enough. They don't want to quite disassociate themselves because then they'll be seen as the new elites, and yet, this really wasn't what we had in mind. The Donatists as a whole were profoundly opposed to worldly authority, any fraternizing with the world. They styled themselves Maccabeans. If you remember, the Maccabeans are there in that intertestamental period leading up to the time of Christ, eager for martyrdom, for armed revolution. Things get so bad that the city folk, anyone associated with the empire, did not dare to travel to the countryside. It's the Circumcilians begin taking over towns. They take over trade routes. So it's like, okay, us city folks in Charlotte, you can't go to the beach anymore because all of the roads heading out to the beach are armed by Circumcilians. You can't go to any of the small towns because the Donatists have taken over those towns. Trade suffered. Credit became impossible. North Africa is a mess. It's a violent political mess. The Roman Empire doesn't like messes. So they respond with force, often persecuting the Donatists, occupy their towns, killing them sometimes in mass, but the Donatists could not be wiped out. The Circumcilians were an expression of deep discontent among many of the lower class. Constantine tried diplomacy. He tried to end the dispute, but to no avail. It really wasn't finally until the Muslim conquest of the 7th century that the Donatists and the Circumcilians finally disappeared. Now, the major time frame is the 4th century so in the 300s, but it's not until the 600s when finally the Donatists disappear. Into the mix of this Donatist controversy is a man you'll hear more about in a couple of weeks, Augustine. Augustine engaged the Donatists in debate for more than a decade. You've perhaps heard of Augustine's just war theory. What are the reasons to go to war that are just? And within war, what are the ways in which you should conduct yourselves? That famous just war theory is developed in controversy with the Donatists because the empire is at war with the Donatists, and Augustine is helping to think through, well, how do we do this, and are we justified? He engaged them in debate, and at first, it was Augustine's stated opinion that he wanted to try to win them over with words and with arguments. But eventually, as their violence grew, he changed his mind, and he saw that, yes, the empire would be right to come and to remove the Donatists by force. He assumed that the state should intervene to punish heretics. Now, it wasn't quite that Augustine thought, there's all these nuances, and people quickly say, theocracy. That's not what he saw. He didn't think that the state and the church were no longer distinguishable. He wasn't equating the two. But in Augustine's mind, he thought, well, these are Christians, the Donatists. He believed they were Christians, but they were schismatics, and they had separated themselves, and they needed to be disciplined. And they were refusing discipline from the true church, and they needed to be brought back into the fold. And so Augustine's mind, he's thinking, well, if the state is willing to help us do our church discipline, shouldn't we be grateful for the state to come and help us and come by force? I think most of us would not follow that train of thought, but that's what he was thinking. Even had a verse, Luke 14:23, where Jesus talks about the go out into the highways and the byways and invite people to the great banquet. And then Luke 14:23, whomever you find, force them to come in. So Augustine and others said, don't you hear that? Force them. They should be physically brought into the church. Their very souls are in danger. If we really care about them, wouldn't we do everything possible, including physical force, to bring them back to the church? That was his thinking. He also argued, and we would say incorrectly, I think, but Augustine argued that the parable of the wheat and the tares is about the church. You go read it, and it's about the world, but he saw it was about the church. He said the church is a place where you're going to have wheat and you're going to have tares. The church is a hospital. The church is a hospital for sick people. And you come into the hospital because you're sick, and you're here to get better. Now, we would agree with that on one level, but this is really the beginning of a sacramental system, for all that we agree with Augustine on, and all of the reformers drew from Augustine, and yet his sacramental view of the church was something different, because his mind, and in what we would know as the Roman Catholic system, yet the church provides all of these sacraments from birth to death. And you have baptism, which is giving you justification, and then you move up along, and you have all of these sacraments the church provides you. So you're all a part of the church, and the church is going to have different tiers of people. And some are going to be very serious Christians, and some are going to be not very serious Christians, but everyone belongs here, the wheat and the tares, because you come to a hospital to get well. You can see the logic behind it, even if the exegesis had problems. So Augustine, from our vantage point, made some mistakes, and yet, on the whole, he was right as he opposed the Donatists. He made a number of theological points. One, Augustine said, the validity of any rite administered by the church does not depend upon the moral virtue of the person administering it. The sacrament The ritual, the rite, does not depend upon the moral virtue of the person administering it. Of course, we want the priests, we want the bishops to be examples of godliness. But the rite itself is not dependent. If it did, Augustine said, well, how righteous do you have to be? How moral does the bishop have to be? What sort of sins? What if he had some sin 20 years ago? Does that nullify the work that he's doing? What if he has a little sin? How big? How many sins does it have to be? You can see in our day, it's not the same kind of things, but anytime you see a pastor fall or caught in sin, it's very destabilizing. People say, well, I learned from this person, or I read his books, or I was helped by his sermons. And Augustine would be helpful here to say, of course, we don't excuse that, but the truth of the word that is preached is still true, and the rites that were administered are not dependent upon the moral exemplar of the one doing it. How worthy would we have to be, other words? Augustine said, second, if the Donatists are right, then one tainted bishop can throw off all of Christendom. Is that really the system that we want? You got to go back in, and if you got one bishop, Felix was one of the bishops who laid hands on Cecilian. Now you're saying that the rest of the church is a mess? This heresy or schism of the Donatists is, as I said at the outset, most perplexing to me. Because and I've tried to, I'm not a Donatist, and I believe Augustine was right theologically against the Donatists, but I've tried to present in a way to try to show some of the conflict that must have been felt. You think about what the confessors suffered. You think about the social and geographic dimensions to the conflict. This side of the equation, we probably would have said, were the conservatives. They're the ones saying, let's be most rigorous. Living your life with integrity is most important. They wanted a disciplined church. And you can't blame them for wanting a bishop that they knew. Sometimes these other bishops didn't speak their language. They weren't from them, and yet they had authority over them. But as sympathetic as we might be, we can say the Donatists made a few big mistakes. One, we cannot create a true church by looking to the unimpeachable lives of its members. Yes, there must be church discipline for those who refuse to repent, but isn't it the case that we should be defined by grace even before we are defined by our rigor? So the Donatists would say something like, or perhaps was in their hearts, we are the ones who, or we are the ones who didn't, when isn't the first thing that should be in our hearts, we are the ones for whom God. It's not to say that obedience and disobedience is irrelevant. Of course it isn't. But it is a subtle distinction. Do we come together as God's people, and what's first in our heart is, well, we're the ones who get this right and we don't get that wrong? Or are we the ones who say, first of all, we are the ones for whom God has done something? Second mistake is to think that the ministry could rise or fall with the worthiness of the one ministering. Again, it's no excuse for wicked ministers or church leaders to commit egregious sins, but we should not think the effectiveness of ministry is tied to the moral life of the one doing it. It is tied to the authority of God's word. Do you remember in Philippians chapter 1, Paul says, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. Philippians 1. You see what Paul's getting at? We tend to think since truth is measured by sincerity. If you're really sincere, he really believes it. She's really sincere. He's really a nice person, so what he's saying must be true. Well, sincerity is important, but Paul says the opposite. There are some people preaching the gospel, and they're doing it out of envy, out of rivalry. They're doing it because I'm in prison, and they just want to stir up more problems for me. But Paul says, you know what? Their motives are wrong. They're insincere. They're not good people. But they are saying what is true. And I give thanks. I wish they were different, but they're saying what is true. The truth that is spoken is the power in ministry. And then third, we would say, it does, though it wasn't the main thrust of the debate, lurking in the background certainly is some failure to acknowledge forgiveness. This was a Judas. Okay, maybe he was. But there's also Peter's. Peter denied Christ 3 times, and he was reinstated 3 times. Feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. So at its worst in this conflict, those who had denied Christ could only be Judases for all time, without any understanding that perhaps they could be a Peter and repent. This controversy shows, as I alluded to a moment ago, we're almost done, flaws in this very hierarchical episcopal model of apostolic succession. We believe in an apostolic succession of the apostles' doctrine. You must be teaching the doctrine of the apostles, or you are not a legitimate minister. But they have this very strict line of ordination, and you can see the problems that arise. If you get 1 degree off with the wrong person in this apostolic line of succession, then everyone under you is off. There was an example of this just this past year. I don't know if any of you saw this story. It's almost fantastical, but it's true. February of this past year, Reverend Andres Arango, a Catholic priest in Arizona, resigned after it was discovered that he had been using the wrong baptismal formula throughout his career. Instead of saying, and when I read this story, I panicked. I was like, have I said this right? He got 1 word off. Instead of saying, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, he said, we baptize you. And especially in the Catholic system, the priest is operating as a vicar of Christ, a representative of Christ. The priest, I baptize you. It's not we. It's not the church or it's not the congregation administering this. It's the priest in the line of the apostolic succession. So the fact that he said, we baptize you instead of I, rendered, this is what the Catholic Church said, thousands of baptisms illegitimate. And since baptism is the sacrament initiating someone into the life of grace, all the subsequent sacraments received by those persons were also illegitimate. So they had to go and find who are all the people baptized because they weren't really baptized because he said the wrong thing. This controversy also reminds us that there is no golden age of the church. I hope you see this in this class on church history. There are heroes. We need heroes. There are better times and worse times. There are things to learn. But there is no golden age. So there is no century where the church was always pristine, always got it right. Look at this. We know of the stories of some of the heroes, the martyrs, the confessors. But sometimes in persecution, the Christians didn't stand strong. And isn't this an ugly scene of important theological controversy that spills over into regional conflict and class disputes and political fighting? There is no golden age. That's not meant to discourage us, but to make us realistic. Don't be surprised when we see difficulties in our own day. We're often liable to think that things have never been worse. They're always getting worse, and they always would have been better if only we could have lived in the days of Augustine. Well, Augustine wrote so much because there were so many heresies. We also need to beware the sin of schism. We often think of those cries for unity to come from maybe liberal Christians who don't care about truth, and that happens. But it is also possible to have churches or just Christians fall out over trifling matters. Irenaeus, remember him back in the 2nd century, said, God shall judge those who give rise to schisms, who are destitute of the love of God, who look to their own special advantage rather than to the unity of the church, and who for trifling reasons, or any kind of reason which occurs to them, cut in pieces and divide the great and glorious body of Christ. Styles, personalities, trifling issues, dividing along racial lines, ethnic, social, economic lines. Or beware of this Donatist impulse that says, you know what? Outside of our own circle, there's nobody else who's getting it right. No other true church. I'm glad to be a Presbyterian, and I hope when we get those seminars in heaven, show that Calvin had it all right. Turretin helped to explain it a little bit further, and the Westminster Confession is what the angels had been passing around for millennia. We're not the only true church. We're not the only ones preaching Christ. We're not the only ones who, in fact, we have things to learn from others. Let us not be destitute of the love of God, especially when believers have the same creeds or the same liturgy, the same theology, the same worship. This is not like the Arians worshiping a different Christ. But at its worst, neither side, the Catholics or the Donatists, could see that actually they're believing the same thing. And it shows us finally that God can use sinners. If the Donatists made one chief error, it was in thinking that whoever has grievous sin in their past can no longer be a faithful minister in the present. But of course, all of us have things we wish we hadn't done, things we're not proud of. Just this past week, feel like you've been a bad mom or dad or friend or parent or pastor. And so in the end, though Augustine got some things wrong in this debate, we should be thankful that Augustine got mostly it right, because his overarching point was that Christ is the minister. Christ is the one doing the ministry. And if Christ is the one doing the ministry, then even when there are traitors in our past, we can still trust that Christ is accomplishing his work.